Welcome to Fellowship Safaris, conversations about people of color and their journeys to subspecialist training in their countries of origin and around the world. Hi everyone, welcome to Fellowship Safaris. My name is Njeri Karianjahi. I'm the host of Fellowship Safaris, and this is my Fellowship Safari story. I am a consultant pediatrician and adolescent medicine specialist. This means that I had done my fellowship in adolescent medicine in Toronto, Canada. The best way for me to be able to tell this story is to just go back to the beginning. And so in 2018, after having sat down with my friends over a random Sunday afternoon lunch, it became very clear to me that I would actually need to pursue this fellowship seriously. These friends of mine are also colleagues and also pediatricians and extraordinaires, in their own right. And I want to give a big shout out because this conversation is what then led me to start my search for a fellowship in adolescent medicine. After I lamented about how I'm not being able to, get a program that makes sense, that is affordable, that I can be able to connect with, one of my friends in that group actually pointed out, why don't you look into Canada? And the good thing is, once you Google the particular institution, there's always a connect email with a program director or coordinator or, fellowship, administrator who you can be in touch with. So send them an email, let them know that this is something that you're interested in and go for it. And that's exactly what I did that night. I sat and I Googled and I landed on 3 institutions in Canada. 2 of them, unfortunately, or, depending on how you look at it, fortunately, were not for me and I was not for them. So one institution had actually said that I need to be self-sponsored. And just for, context, $1 is 90 Kenya shillings. And I just simply did not have the money to be able to support myself for a fellowship. And so that was out of the question. The second option was the institution said that I needed to be funded by my government and needed to be seconded by my government to be able to do this program. And at that time, the government was not funding any adolescent medicine fellowships. And so those 2 institutions were out of reach for me, which left this one institution. What was really, really helpful was that the program director at the time was very proactive on email and actually invited me to come and do an observership. I'd never heard of an observership. It sounded like a very straightforward thing. However, I had no idea what to be able to expect of these 2 weeks. This observership was going to be on my own, out of my own cost. So fly yourself to Canada, get your own accommodation, and they let you observe and just see what happens in the division for a couple of weeks. And then at the end of that, they have you sit down for an in-person interview. So initially I was like, okay, sounds simple enough. However, I was like, that sounds too simple. So I reached out to a friend of mine who's doing their fellowship in Canada at that time, as well as another friend who was working at another university in a different province. And the person from this different province actually said, oh, if you're going to be doing an observership for the next 2 weeks, it means that they will also be observing you. They'll want to see how you interact with patients, how you, engage in conversation, your problem-solving skills over that couple of weeks. Now, again, for context, I was going in as an international graduate. I didn't have an active practice license to work in Ontario. And so that meant my observership was literally being in the room, shadowing with the residents and with the staff and with the fellows who are there. However, I could not practice. I could not directly handle the patients myself. I was not allowed to. So this was tricky for me. So I was like, how am I going to impress these guys? And basically, I'm not doing anything but being present in the room. And so what was helpful was that my other friend said actively engage, ask questions, give feedback. When people are, trying to come up with a plan, give your input, because at least those are some of the things that you can be able to proactively do. And that's what I did. The other thing that helped me in terms of preparing for the interviews is that I had been told about something called CanMed's roles. And what these roles are kind of like what's the expectation of a physician at a subspecialty level, being a scholar, growing as a scholar, being a collaborator, being a communicator. And so she actually had me read through these things and prepare for my interview. Had I not had that conversation and not had that, sort of feedback from my friends, I don't think we would be having this conversation today, because I would not have passed that interview, because I would not have been adequately prepared for a Canadian interview. And so a big shout out to these two friends of mine. I don't know if they'll get to listen to the podcast, but if they do, you know yourselves. Thank you so much. We finally get to Toronto, Canada. The 2 weeks was just amazing, just getting to see people that I'd only read about, read their journal articles, and just being able to interact with them in person. And it was like, a rock concert basically for an adolescent medicine, fellow hopeful. So it was amazing. And thankfully, I managed to pass my interview, and I was told that they really liked me and would have wanted me to join the program. The only thing was that there were no slots in 2019 that were available. The only slots that were available were in 2020. I was crestfallen. However, I decided to stay on track and said, you know what, I'd still be interested in 2020. It was helpful to have sat with a mentor of mine who advised me to take that year in between to improve my skill or learn something else that would help me be better positioned in adolescent medicine. And so I was able to apply for a graduate diploma program at the University of Melbourne. And it was a graduate diploma in adolescent health and well-being. And this program helped me think more critically and in a more structured way about healthcare systems for adolescents, thinking through how do we set up their services, how do we prepare teams to be able to take care of them, how do I think in a more culturally sensitive way, just in terms of how I'm going to provide services for adolescents. For context, in Kenya, we have over 40 different languages and different cultures. And so when you're thinking about the young people and adolescents in a particular community, you have to be so mindful that one shoe doesn't fit all. And you have to think about what would be appropriate for a particular culture and for a particular setting. And so this training over that 1 year was life changing, practice changing, and I believe prepared me even more for the fellowship that was to come. I received the official letter from my institution. I'm now going to get into the fellowship program. And this email was loaded. It was loaded with everything you could possibly need in terms of information. So it had my contract, it had a timeline of the different documents that I would need to do and what I'd need to do at each step. It even had, like pointers on this is how you'd be able to apply for this document. This is the person that you need to connect with once this document is done with. And while this was super helpful, it was also really, really overwhelming, because some of those checklists, I will not lie, had at least 20 things before you could proceed to the next step. So in the contract, it said that I would be a departmental fellow and I'd be working full time. I would be working in the pediatrics department, and that would be a full-time job. And I would also be doing my adolescent medicine fellowship, which was also full-time. At the time, I did the conversion again from Canadian dollar to Kenya shilling, and it looked like it would be a lot of money. What I had not factored in was the cost of living, which is 4 times the amount in Canada as it is in Kenya. Because I was planning to travel with my family, thankfully, the amount that they had stated in the contract would be enough to be able to sustain us for the duration of time of fellowship. However, it did mean that I cannot cut back in terms of my hours because I was supporting not just myself, but we were a family unit that was going to move. So, pro tip, don't try and convert whatever you see as the salary that's going to be into your local currency, because you're not going to be practicing in your local, context. You'll be in that country. If at all, it would be better to look at, people in your grading or in your category and see if however much is being offered on the contract matches with what a person at your level of training is receiving. So that's a pro tip that I wanted to mention. The other thing that I found really helpful was the chart with the timelines. It was really, really helpful for me because I printed it out and stuck it on the wall, and it helped me work through the different things that I needed to do. There were many documents, like from the academic part, that I needed to work through. And then there was the immigration stuff that I needed to start working through. Now, that timeline kind of got skewed because, like I mentioned, my program was starting in 2020. And because of COVID, instead of starting my program in July of 2020, I ended up starting my program in September of 2020. It was super stressful because when the program officially started, you're still not in the country. You're kind of doing your lessons, via Zoom and virtually. And those are the first days of virtual. So it was still a bit clunky for me. I wasn't very familiar with, a lot of the techie stuff when it came to virtual learning. And it was a bit of a steep learning curve. What was helpful, again, the program director was constantly checking in with me, finding out how I'm doing, finding out what the progress was, and reminding me that I'm part of the group. I'm part of the department and the division now. And it was really that affirmation really helped me, even as we waited for things to open up and allow for us to travel. So, fast forward into September 2020, we travel, we land in Canada. Once I got my work permit, I actually thought that I was going to start work maybe in a week or two. Turns out I ended up starting work in maybe a month and a half. And that was because the licensing board does take a little bit of time. And the only way they're able to do the final step is if you get your work permit at the border. So what that meant for me was that I had to constantly call almost every day, just following up to find out what's happening with my license. Has it come out yet? And when can I anticipate to get it? Because the other thing was that as long as I wasn't working, I wasn't receiving payment. I wasn't getting a salary. And so this month and a half, you're in a new country, you're with your family, and we were just sort of like trying to figure out how we would survive, during that duration of time. The division that I, was studying in was helpful in that instance because they were able to advocate for me to be able to get some resources and support my family during that duration of time. If it had not been for them advocating for me and also, supporting my family and I'm not too sure how much longer we would have been able to weather waiting for the board to get back to us. So even as you're thinking through programs and you're on a full scholarship in a Canadian, institution, it's always good to make sure that you go with savings because you don't know when you'll actually start working. So you need to have enough for rent, for food, for transport, and your utilities. Once the program did get started, it was one of the most enriching experiences of my life. And I say that because for such a long time, as an avid adolescent medicine advocate and, as a pediatrician who really wanted to provide that extra service to teens, I struggled a lot in terms of putting all the things that I read about virtually into practice. And I needed to just be in the room. I just needed to be in the space and understand what the hidden curriculum was, understand and get to see the nuances of adolescent medicine clinical practice. And the only way I could do that was in person. And the only way I could appreciate that was being there physically. And this is not to, discredit any virtual programs there are out there. However, when it comes to certain clinical skills, it's really, really helpful. I was very grateful to have gotten to learn all these things in person and get to see such a variety of all these different adolescent medicine concerns and cases, as well as approaches to care. What was helpful is that the institution that I worked in had people from different walks of life and different cultures. There were some parts that were not as pretty. I had really long, long nights. I was working full time also in pediatrics in the wards during COVID. And so there was a huge workload in pediatrics. And so trying to be able to balance that with my actual fellowship was really, really tough. And I couldn't cut back on my hours. Just finding that balance between learning and rest was one of those things that was really overwhelming in the beginning, very exhausting through the entire process. And, to a certain extent, I really wish someone would have just come to me and said, you know what, we'll pay for the rest of your program. You don't have to do any more calls, just show up and learn. But this whole fellowship process and through all the stories you're going to hear about from myself and my colleagues is that we learn how to make lemonade from the lemons that are dished at us. The other thing that I had not been prepared for in the hospital setting was learning and practicing while Black. And what does that mean? So I had done my undergraduate and my postgraduate in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'd never been a minority ever in my life, in my learning experience. And so coming into a space where there would be instances where I was the only Black person in the room or the only Black female in the room was kind of tough for me because I don't like standing out. I like being able to be part of a group and not really stand out. But I stood out just by simple virtue of the color of my skin. The other thing that I found frustrating was that as a result of the color of my skin, there were certain people who talked to me in a certain way, which I was not ready for. You'd find a particular caregiver or parent. Sometimes it was different members of staff who talked to you in one way, which was very, very different from how they would speak to like Caucasian counterparts. And this was really subtle. It wasn't like in your face. And while the institution had all these things in place to help in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, the subtleties could not be ignored. And that was a bit tough for me. It was really, really hard to contend with at some point in my training and very, very discouraging. The other thing was also just understanding how racial bias works in a health system and just seeing the outcome of that when you see, children and adolescents of color having to experience things differently from Caucasian patients and Caucasian, adolescents. So that was also a little bit tough. This was something that largely I had mainly read about and not really been in the system to witness some of the things that happened. It was very painful to see. We not only were in one institution, we did rotate through other institutions to sort of like diversify our learning. And so just understanding the influence of racial bias in the healthcare system in North America. I've never felt so helpless in my life. And that frustrated me because I'm a doer. I like to be able to do problem solution. Like let's get things done. What do I need to do to improve the situation? It was also just learning a new medical, health information system, which was very, very different from what I'd been used to in Nairobi, Kenya. There were very many things coming at me that I needed to learn, and I needed to learn them quickly. And I almost quit, to be honest. I was consistently anxious to the point where I would be approaching the hospital and I'd start shaking and I'd break out into a sweat. That over time, I noticed affected my mental health. Although people don't really talk about mental health in fellowship, I think it's really important to bring it up because a lot of people do suffer and don't know what to do. Thankfully, in the institution I was working at for wellness, the university had provided, mental health services that would be for free. Initially, when I'd received that information, let me not lie to you, I looked at it and was like, I'm never going to leave this. I'm okay. I'm fine. I was able to connect with mental health care professionals and had a few sessions, and they were able to give me strategies that really, built up my toolkit and helped me through the next couple of years. 3 months in is when I realized, you know what, if I've made it through 3 months, I can see this thing through to the end. This was my dream. This is what I really, really wanted to do. And I needed to be at my best mental health to be able to do it. If you're going to a foreign country and you're going to a particular institution, just find out what are the wellness structures? What do you have access to? What does your insurance, your student insurance, or the health insurance cover? That is something that I really feel strongly about. What was also helpful was that we had mentors and members of staff who frequently checked in with us, just finding out how are you doing, how are you settling in, what's going on with you. And that really broke down that hierarchy thing for me significantly. And I was able to be more open and I was able to be more authentic in my learning space. And that really went a long way towards me having psychological safety in learning. And I didn't have that privilege in undergraduate and in postgraduate so much. And I always went into spaces very pensive, not sure if I should mention something, not sure if I should speak up, if at all. And now I went into this space where psychological safety was proactively practiced and done in a different way from what I had gotten used to. And I'm so grateful for having seen that, because if I do get the opportunity to teach, that I hope to be that safe space for other learners who I encounter. Another thing that I absolutely, was blown away by was our division had actually gotten a career counselor so that you're able to think more in a more structured way around your subspecialty. How do you, prepare yourself for interviews? How do you negotiate? How do you brand yourself? It was such an important step for me. I'd never had this. That was a transformative thing. And I think for a lot of medics and for a lot of fellows, that's something that we do need to invest in. Another thing that I got to learn about was narrative medicine. And this was towards the end of my fellowship, the use of different art forms, different forms of story to be able to bear witness to what happens to patients, what happens to clinicians and healthcare workers, and how that interaction can make us more mindful about our approaches. That narrative medicine experience, to be honest, is sort of what births this idea of the podcast for me. I don't have any regrets. In fact, if anything, I'm really grateful. I traveled with my family and they have been such a huge, 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 support for me, beginning with my husband and my daughter. And then there's my parents and my siblings. I can't mention everyone's name on the podcast. However, I do want to thank each and every person who picked up my call, who responded to my texts, who would call me back, who would let me rant and rave about fellowship, or just listen to me crying on the phone and pray over me. And let the record state that I'm really, really grateful. One piece of advice to anyone who's thinking about doing an adolescent medicine fellowship, or any fellowship for that matter, my advice would be do the thing. In fact, do it afraid. Don't wait to be courageous to step in. Just do it afraid. Go in, discover things about yourself, be unafraid to make mistakes, because that's the only way you're going to learn. I'm hoping that this will help somebody, this will encourage somebody, and this will help also people who are either starting programs or thinking about ways to improve the fellows' experience, that my experience and my encounter will help and be better for the future. So thanks everyone for listening. This has been Fellowship Safaris. I look forward to your feedback on all podcast platforms, and I look forward to being able to interact with what you have to say about this episode. Thanks everyone. Bye. I'm so glad you stayed tuned. Please get the word out and share it with at least 3 people. Make this episode like a chain letter. Share it, share it, share it. Come back
for the next leg of our safari, where we'll be talking about...
was it a surprise to your husband that you still wanted to go back to go to school?
No, it wasn't.
How did you take the news?
I'm those kind of people that are like, oh yeah, I thought that was coming in at some point.
It takes a village to make this podcast. Strategic and creative direction was done by Njeri Karianjahi and Melissa Mbogwa. The producer of the show is Melissa Mbogwa. Tevin Sudi is the sound engineer, with thanks to AQ Studios. The graphic design was done by Benjamin Boyer, and the original music was done by husband extraordinaire Mwakavi Maweo. This is an Africa Podfest production.